We have a really exciting and informative group of speakers here. And so in this next session, presenters will focus on the impact of cycling and physical activity on how we think, how we feel, and how we behave. We'll hear first from Dr. Alan Reese and Dr. Stephanie Van Riper, who are representing from Stanford University. Dr. Reese is the professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences at Stanford University. He is a leader in child and adolescent psychiatry and uses advanced research methods and tools to focus on neurodevelopmental and neurogenetic disorders. Dr. Van Riper is a postdoctoral scholar at the Center for Interdisciplinary Brain Sciences Research at Stanford, and the focus of her work is to understand how exercise influences brain activity and cognitive function in neurodevelopmental disorders. After that, we'll hear from Dr. Pat O'Connor, who is a professor of kinesiology at the University of Georgia. His research explores relationships between physical activity and psychological well-being, including anxiety, cognition, energy, pain, and sleep. Finally, we'll hear from Mallory Polster and Joshua Agboifi from the Office of Disease Prevention and Health Promotion. Mallory is a public health analyst who supports the implementation of the National Youth Sports Strategy and the Physical Activity Guidelines for Americans. Joshua is a health communications fellow who provides project support for the Move Your Way campaign and supports the Office of Disease Prevention and Health Promotion Health Equity Work Group. We look forward to this great lineup of presenters, and don't forget to submit your questions via the Whova app for this session. With that, we'll get started with our first presentation. Hear from Dr. O'Connor first, so I'm going to go ahead and get your slides ready. All right, Pat, take it away.
Okay, can you hear me first off?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, great. So thank you so much for the brief intro, and it's a great pleasure for me to talk about the preliminary results of an experiment that we're doing, that we're looking at the influence of high-intensity cycling on memory in adolescents with ADHD. If I could have the next slide. So this research is based in part on prior research that was done by my former doctoral student, Katie Fritz. And in that experiment, she looked at the effects of 20 minutes of moderate intensity cycling on mood, motivation, and sustained attention, obviously a problem for people with ADHD. And this was done with college men with elevated ADHD symptoms. And the sustained attention task asked the participants to look at a screen while a number came up every second for 15 minutes. It's an awful task. Everybody hates it. And then they're asked to press one button when the number 6 comes up, and then to press a different button every time there's 3 odd numbers in a row that are different. So 133 would not be what they're looking for, but 135 would be. And in that study, the mood was improved. The motivation to do the cognitive test was actually improved, but the cognitive test itself was not improved. So in going forward with our current research, we made 3 research design changes. First, we went with higher intensity of exercise with the hopes, and we're speculating here, there's not good research on high intensity exercise and its action on brain circuits, but in any case, our hope was it might activate the brain circuits involved in learning and memory a little bit better. And then rather than doing the boring sustained attention task, we thought it might be better to try something potentially more engaging, and we chose a 15-minute Portuguese second language learning lesson. And so I collaborated with my colleague at University of Georgia, Robert Moser, who's an expert on second language learning of Portuguese. And then the third change was inspired by research with mice, in which was conducted by Dr. Kottman. And one of his findings is that the learning that you get from associated with the exercise bout, the brain mechanism for that differs if the exercise is done before the stimuli to be learned compared to the exercise done after the stimuli. to be learned. And if I could get the next slide. So the key elements of the experiment, so far we've tested 18 healthy adolescents with ADHD, and they need to make sure that we needed to make sure that they did not know Portuguese. And the design is something called a between subjects post-test only randomized experiment. And so participants were randomized either to a no exercise control or one of the two exercise conditions. The exercise was 3 30-second all-out cycle sprints, and then 3 minutes rest between those. So we're in a lab trying to control everything, but probably the closest it would come to if you were mountain biking would be climbing a hill hard for 30 seconds and then having a 3-minute relatively easy period that followed that. And then the Portuguese lesson, this was done in our lab. So the participants came in and then they sat in front of a computer and the lesson was on video. And the goal was the presentation of 21 Portuguese words. And then ultimately at the end of the lesson, the hope was that they would at least be able to recognize and be able to say and even write 3 simple sentences like the one shown, a uma mochila azul. And if I could get the next forward on this slide. So there's really 2 days of the experiment. The first day where they either didn't exercise or they did, and then they had the language lesson. And then after that, there was memory tests that were given. And so when the memory tests are given on the same first day of the experiment, we're calling that the memory acquisition phase. They're acquiring the memory. And then they came back to the lab 7 days later, and that longer term period is known as a retention phase. So how well did they remember it many days later? So we had 2 hypotheses. The first one dealt with the condition in which they did the exercise before the Portuguese lesson. And in that condition, and both these hypotheses are based on these animal studies that we had seen that look more mechanistically at the brain. And so the hypothesis was if you do the exercise before the Portuguese lesson, that's going to help most in the memory acquisition phase. In contrast, the second hypothesis was that if you do the exercise after the Portuguese lesson, that was going to help most with your ability to remember it long term, the retention phase. If I could have the next slide. So this slide is a screenshot from the Portuguese lesson. And so one of the things that's very different compared to prior investigations of exercise and its effects on cognitive function is this is like a whole lesson and involves a context. So a lot of the prior studies will just have people, if it involves words, they'll give them a list of words to remember, and there's no connection among the words, or it's like I described with the sustained attention task, a bunch of numbers to remember. So it's not very meaningful for people. We think that potentially this kind of second language learning is more engaging and meaningful, and it could help them remember more if it's done kind of in the context of a class, and in this case, context of a classroom. So this was done by experts. The lesson was created by experts in second language instruction. They used well-developed instructional principles. Words were said by the experts, then they were repeated by the participants. Participants had time to write them down. And the one last thing I'll draw your attention to is while some of the words are, a few of them anyway, are very similar or the same as English words, like you might see video, professor, those are the same as English, whereas others would be words unfamiliar to English speakers, like apagador or lápis. And so if I could have the next slide. There's two memory tests that were given. The harder one is just called a free recall. And so they're just asked after the lesson, how many of these 21 words can you remember? Try to write them all down. So that's the hard test. Then if I could have the next slide. And then the next memory test is a recognition memory, much easier. And so each day, the participants were provided with a list of 20 words. The underlined words represent words that appeared in the Portuguese lesson. And then the other words are so-called lure words. Can they lure the participant into selecting that as a word that might have been presented in the lesson, but they can't quite remember it? And some of those words are designed to be very similar to words presented in the lesson. As an example, if you look in the leftmost column under day one, the second word down, quattro, that's very similar. That one's not underlined, so it's not a word that was presented in the lesson. But if you look in the last fourth column on the right, second word down, quadro is underlined. So quattro is very similar to quadro. And so that was the goal in some of these lure words. And then there's 9 of the 20 words presented to the participant to try to recognize as being in the lesson. 9 of those were actually in the lesson for the day 1 words. And there's different words presented on day 7, and 10 of those words were actually presented in the lesson. And so if I could have the next slide, please. So I'll have one data slide here on the exercise results. That's essentially just a manipulation check. It documents that the exercise was done. So if I could have that next slide, please. So if you look at the figure on the top right, it shows the heart rate response. And the blue line at the bottom shows the controls who did not exercise. And of course, their heart rates did not change, and their heart rates are at resting levels about 80 beats per minute. And then in the 2 exercise conditions, after a warm-up, their heart rate prior to the first all-out cycling bout was about 110 beats per minute. And as you can clearly see, it goes up dramatically for the 3 cycle bouts. And when there's the rest period, it returns towards baseline. But these heart rate values represent high intensity exercise from a cardiorespiratory standpoint. And the bottom scale shows ratings of perceived exertion. And these are hard ratings of perception effort associated with these 30-second all-out bouts. If I can have the next slide. So next, I will present 3 slides that have all the results that I'll present today. So if I could have the next slide. So this first slide is focused on the number of words freely recalled. And so they could recall anywhere from 0 if they weren't very good, up to 21 if they remembered all 21 words. And I want to focus first on the blue bars. So the blue bars are the acquisition phase. It's the data shortly after the Portuguese lessons were done on day 1. And in these memory type of studies, if you ask people to remember a long list of things, typically groups average about 7 things they can remember. And that's what happened in the no exercise control condition. About 6.7 on average was the mean number of words that could be recalled correctly. And then our hypothesis, the first hypothesis, was that memory would be better in the this acquisition phase, the blue bars. Memory would be best in the exercise before the Portuguese lesson condition. So those middle bars, the 8.6 blue bar, it is 2 words better than the no exercise control, but we're not sure that 2 words is quite enough to be a real substantial and meaningful change. And then we also found that there was a large and very meaningful increase in the number of words recalled correctly in the other exercise condition on the right, the exercise after the Portuguese lesson condition. So that's the data on this test related to memory acquisition. Now turning to these orange, let's stay there, thank you. Turning to these orange bars, that's dealing with 7 days later and how well they retained or remembered these words. And you can see all three orange bars are lower, and that's typical. As time goes on, your memory decays. It's harder to remember things unless you're practicing it. And the hypothesis was the best memory would occur in the exercise after Portuguese lesson condition, which is on the right. And you can see that that number is bigger, and so it's 4 more words recalled. So, that hypothesis was essentially confirmed, even despite the relatively small numbers we have here. So there's 5 to 7 participants in these 3 different conditions. So now if I could have the next slide. Okay, so now these data deal with the recognition test, the easier test. And you can see that the performance values are substantially better. So the groups averaged being able to recognize between 80% and 90% of these words on the word lists. And then let's focus on the blue bars first. And that shows the memory acquisition data. And we hypothesized that memory acquisition would be best in the exercise before Portuguese lesson condition in the middle. And in point of fact, that performance was worse. So we certainly were wrong with that hypothesis. And it's moderately worse. So we need to test more to really know if that's a real thing or some kind of random error. And then for the language retention in the orange bars, there's really no difference among those groups. So we didn't find greater memory performance in the exercise after Portuguese condition for this aspect of memory. And then if I could have the next slide. And so the third and final data slide deals with the average percentage of words that are incorrectly identified as presented in the lesson when they actually did not appear in the lesson. So it's like if the word quattro was presented in the lesson and they recognize quadro as presented in the lesson, that's a mistake, and it's called a false negative error. And so looking at those blue bars first again, we see that for the exercise before lesson in the center, blue bar 10.9, that number is a little bit lower than the no exercise control, meaning they made fewer errors, which is better memory, fewer errors. It's in the right direction, but that's not a meaningful change. And again, with the blue bars, we see a bigger effect, a better reduction in errors in the exercise after the Portuguese lesson condition. And then for the memory retention part of this, the orange bars, compared to control, the exercise groups really didn't differ. So if I could have the next slide. So just to summarize, the hypothesis 1 was not supported, and to state it formally there, the evidence shows that 3 30-second high-intensity cycling sprint intervals that had no positive effect on memory for these Portuguese words when the cycling was done before the language lesson. And then for hypothesis 2, that was partially supported. Biggest effect was that when cycling was done after the language lesson, the longer term, that 7-day thing, that free recall memory was improved. But at the same time, this exercise done after the language lesson also had other improvements that were not predicted. These are the improvements in the acquisition phase, where the false negative errors were lower and the immediate free recall of memory was improved. So I guess if there's a take-home message based on the data that we have right now, it looks like if you're trying to learn a second language and it's the first day of class, because that's really what we're looking at, if you do cycling after the lesson, that's going to help you remember more than cycling before or doing nothing. And then if I could have the next slide. So I want to thank Outride for the support to do this research. I want to thank 3 hardworking doctoral students, Daniel Ferreira da Silva. He put together that Portuguese lesson under Dr. Moser's supervision. And then Melissa McGranahan and David Diggs work in my lab conducting the exercise tests. Of course, we thank the participants for being involved, and we had several research assistants who helped with different parts of the investigation. If I could have the last slide. So thank you. And those of you who know Portuguese will know that obrigada is a thank you. And I now welcome your questions or comments.
Thank you, Dr. O'Connor, for your presentation. We've got a couple minutes for questions. So again, if you have a question, you can submit your questions via the Whova app or by clicking Ask a Question under the session you're in, or via the Zoom Q&A feature. I'd like to just start out by, saying, did this result surprise you? I know, some results you might see, performing better, say for a math test. If you exercise before, do you think the different type of domain knowledge is affected by when you do exercise?
Well, I guess we were partially correct. So that part was not the surprise. A little disappointment where we don't see what looks like a big effect. And then the surprise is where these places where the exercise after the lesson seems to help and we didn't predict it. And the caveat is we need to test a few more just to kind of give more confidence to the results. And, as you get more data, you get more and more confident that you've got a result. And then you could say, oh, that's very surprising or not.
And this is unique, as you said, in that you're using a much more, real life language task than what you may have used previously in the lab, correct?
Yeah, and the hope is that down the road, if we can keep doing these kind of experiments, I've got Dr. Moser's ear on this. He's interested in it, and it may be that this could be a way to help folks learn a second language. It turns out, like for example, people who work for this U.S. government who travel to another country in a security realm or what have you, they might have to quickly learn a second language from Russian to whatever. And most of that is done in a seated position. 8 hours, they're sitting trying to learn the language. They don't move around much. And so even if they're not doing the cycling part, some kind of activity may really be helpful for them. So we hope to continue this work in several different ways.
That's great. So we've got a question here related to that note is, are there longer term plans to implement that research into, an actionable, guide or recommendation list for those who'd like to, learn about learning a second language better?
Yeah, we really want to do it. We applied for another grant to try to do that. Dr. Moser, for example, he runs a program to Brazil, students at Athens, Georgia. Once they get their language good enough, they go to Brazil. And then they spend a year down there and get very fluent. So we want to, measure their physical activity here and then there and associate it with how quickly they learn the language. And so, yeah, we just need, the funding helps to get things done. So we have high hopes to move it forward.
Well, great. Thank you so much. That's all the time we have for questions, but thank you for sharing this important topic. I know we have a lot of educators in the audience that are really keen on hearing the effects of, exercise and when to best implement. So thanks again, Pat.
Okay, thank you.